Hello and welcome to the Venezuelan podcast. I'm Ryan Mallett-Outtrim and I'm here to talk about the biggest news from Venezuela. This week we're talking about the surprise announcement of the Supreme Court that it would be assuming legislative power. What does this mean? Well, to help us unpack what's going on, I've got Rachael Rojas here. She's one of our top journalists in Caracas. So Rachael, what has the Supreme Court, or the TSJ for its abbreviation in Spanish, what's it actually decided to do?
Well, hi Ryan, thanks for having me on via Q&A. It's a really controversial decision. It's basically based on a ruling released by the Supreme Court on Wednesday, which, like you indicate, kind of states that the National Assembly is currently in contempt of court, or to use its terms, that it's incapacitated to carry out its constitutional obligations, and as such, while that situation persists, that the Supreme Court is going to assume the National Assembly's constitutional obligations. Obviously, the kind of central point here is, why is the Supreme Court saying that the National Assembly is in contempt of court and that it can't exercise its constitutional responsibilities? That is a long debate because the Supreme Court is referring to a situation that's been going on since December 2015. But just to give you a simplified version, there are basically three opposition legislators in the National Assembly who've been barred by the Supreme Court since December 2015. From being sworn in, because they're being investigated for allegations into vote buying when they were elected. It's important to point out at this point as well that the Supreme Court also barred a pro-government legislator in December 2015 as well. But he's never actually been sworn into the National Assembly, bringing me to my second point, which is contrary to this pro-government legislator, the opposition has in fact decided on numerous occasions to swear these contested three legislators into the National Assembly. And these three legislators are they're basically two for the opposition coalition, the Round Table of Democratic Unity, and there's another legislator who is an Indigenous representative who's also allied to the opposition. So in January of 2016, the opposition decided to flout this, this court order, and these three legislators were sworn in. They then subsequently changed their mind and removed these three legislators, which gave us a period from January to April where they were kind of holding session in Parliament. And in July, they go back on their decision to withdraw these three legislators, and they once again swear in these three contested legislators. Kind of since that point in July, the Supreme Court has said that the National Assembly is in contempt of court. It's deliberately flouted the Supreme Court order. As such, it's nullified. The decisions that it takes are do not have kind of legal value. And parliamentary sessions have also been boycotted by pro-government legislators. There's been a couple of things that have happened since then as well, which are important to take into account because they're often omitted in the mainstream media. So, for instance, obviously in the latter part of 2016, we saw the kind of currently the unfolding of the national dialogue between the government and the opposition. And at that point in November, these three legislators who was in Parliament allegedly resigned. They allegedly handed over again, their resignation to the National Assembly. But then it transpired just weeks later, obviously, as the national dialogue came to an end, or at least a temporary end while it's been frozen, that these three legislators then decided to go back on their decision to resign. And actually, if you look at kind of some of the tweets from some of the legislators, in particularly kind of Julio Escarza, who's one of the contested legislators, he says at the beginning of December, we've reincorporated ourselves back into Parliament, and we've asked the leadership of the opposition to take the issue of our resignation out of the talk, so to take that option off the table. So, I mean, obviously the opposition's been playing with these three legislators, using them as bargaining chips with the government in national government, and that kind of partly explains the to-in and fro-in that, they basically use them to kind of, to get to fulfill political aims, we'll put it like that. So, for instance, to kind of like manufacture a constitutional crisis for consumption outside of the country, or use them as bargaining chips with the government. And so so they're basically bargaining chips up until now. Now, actually, in January 2017, just now, the opposition once again voted to withdraw these three legislators from the National Assembly, but the Supreme Court said that they haven't done this under the stipulations that they've put forward, and that what they basically mean by that is
they had to go through like a specific process, right? There was a very specific process they had to fulfill, and they just didn't do it.
No.
Yeah,
no, they're still in contempt of court. Basically, that's the kind of crux of the issue.
Right. So it seems like there's a simple solution: just get rid of these legislators that aren't supposed to be there. But I think we had a few other questions I want to go through, but I think the most important one, or certainly the one that I think our readers or listeners in this case are most interested in, is what's going to happen next? Or is this move by the Supreme Court, is it going to deepen the revolution? Is it going to exacerbate the current institutional crisis? Or is this perhaps more of a symptom of a deepening political crisis? What's your take on this?
I mean, it's very difficult to say, what's going to happen next. Like you say, there is this definitely an institutional crisis in Venezuela. Separation of powers is not working as it should, in relation to the Constitution. I mean, I suppose if you look at it from the point of view of at least from the Supreme Court, there's been this stalemate, at least since July, where these two powers are not paying each other any attention. So I think this is kind of like a move by the Supreme Court to say, up until now you've been able to ignore us, but you're not going to be able to ignore us anymore. So I think maybe trying to put pressure on the National Assembly to bring it into the fold, to make it act according to the Constitution, and actually kind of maybe kind of try and resolve the situation. If that's I don't think they're going to be successful there, because as we've seen, the National Assembly has totally resisted all attempts by the Supreme Court to it's not interested in legislating, basically. So if we look, for instance, right the way through 2016, it's just not a body that is aimed at, it's not the actions of a legislative power that, that wants to fulfill its constitutional obligations. We've got things like the laws that are attempted to pass in 2016, like 75% of them were totally unconstitutional.
Right, and blatantly unconstitutional.
Blatantly. So it's not like suddenly the National Assembly is going to think, oh, well, all we have to do is kind of withdraw these three legislators, under the stipulations outlined by the Supreme Court, and we can go back to legislating, because that would be to mistake basically the National Assembly's kind of objectives over the past year. So I think like you said, there's been all these we have this period between like maybe February and April where they try and pass these laws which are blatantly unconstitutional, and here I'm referring to laws like the amnesty law, the law to privatize social housing, and they're not, they're kind of thrown out by the Supreme Court quite predictably, because there are real grounds to argue that they're unconstitutional. So what does the National Assembly gain by this? It's not really, they know these laws are not going to go ahead. So I think there's two things that they're aiming for, really. There's basically to create this kind of narrative outside of the country, which is really useful for them later on when they start to meet with OAS Secretary General como Luis Almagro, when they start bringing the OAS into Venezuela's problems. This narrative's really useful for them, that there's this democratic crisis, that the National Assembly's basically been effectively nullified by the other two powers, the judiciary and the executive. So that's one thing. And then on the other hand, they've used the National Assembly not as a platform to legislate, but actually as a platform to kind of galvanize their followers around kind of political proposals, which are basically, in essence, anti-government. So there's kind of they're kind of, I'd say that's the strategy of the opposition. So if we accept that as the opposition's strategy, which is, use the National Assembly to galvanise political wills, to promote kind of mobilisation against the government, and also to promote this narrative outside of Venezuela of constitutional and democratic crisis, then it doesn't interest them to remove these kind of three legislators now, even though they've been given this ultimatum by the Supreme Court. In fact, the Supreme Court, you could say, has played into the opposition's hands, because now they've kind of got more kind of fodder for this, for their, both for their kind of supporters on the ground in Venezuela, and also for this, narrative outside. This decision on Wednesday comes just a few days after the Organization of American States had this quite, this widely reported debate on the state of Venezuela's democracy, and this debate over whether that they should apply the Inter-American Democratic Charter against Venezuela. Whether that's, whether the consensus at the time was that the majority of states there kind of favoured dialogue in the country. They wanted to get the talks between the government and the opposition back on track, etc. And there didn't seem to be much of of an appetite for suspending Venezuela from the OAS. Similarly, like even the US, we've got a president there who's extremely, got an extremely aggressive kind of foreign policy, extremely hostile to Venezuela. But, even diplomatically, it looks like the US government has, at least until now, favoured kind of continuing Obama's approach to Venezuela, and that's working with the opposition to try and, push for change, at least, within a representative democracy kind of thing, obviously working under the table with different actors, NGOs and the opposition, but it's not favoured kind of outright intervention, although we do have to take into account the sanctions applied by Obama, etc. So, there's that whether this, is going to lead to some kind of, international intervention, there doesn't seem to be a lot of indication for that, but it's definitely going to be used, in the international kind of sphere to put pressure on the Venezuelan government. We'll probably go back. There'll probably be more debates at the OAS. Hopefully, there is a possibility that dialogue will then be back on the table, and we'll see what happens there. But both powers have been very intransigent one with the other, and so it's kind of hard to see how this is going to be resolved, either through dialogue, either through even with even pressure from the OS, whatever. It's kind of hard to see, because both sides are just adopting this logic of a bellicose war-like logic of annihilate the other. So in the legislative kind of governmental sphere. So it's very difficult to see what's going to happen next, I think.
Yeah, definitely an uncertain time for Venezuela. I guess we'll have to be watching very closely over the next few weeks and months to see how this plays out. But thank you so much, Rachael, for your input, for helping us unpack this extremely complex situation. I really appreciate it. I'm sure that all of our readers/listeners likewise really value your insights into this. So thanks so much.
No problem. Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye. Bye.